At 1 p.m. on March 15, 2019, thousands of impassioned school kids marched out of their institutions and gathered in Cathedral Square in Christchurch, New Zealand, to join a global movement demanding climate justice. One of the organizers, 17-year-old Mia Sutherland, said that the high point was when the whole crowd sang "Rise Up," a strike anthem written by 12-year-old Lucy Gray. While Mia was up on the mic to close out the day, she was swiftly interrupted and told to shut it all down, now. Everyone had to get out immediately, but stay away from Hagley Park. Confused, she pulled out her phone and saw the headline. Just 10 minutes away, a 28-year-old Australian man had opened fire in 2 mosques during Friday prayers, killing 50, including a 3-year-old child. The killer, like most far-right terrorists, was obsessed with white genocide, which they attribute to non-white immigration, seeing non-white peoples as invaders. He also identified as an ethno-nationalist eco-fascist, and although clearly driven by racist hate and misogyny, he framed his actions in part as environmental protection, stating that continued immigration into Europe is environmental warfare. One climate crisis, 2 very different reactions and proposed solutions. 4 months later, on August 3, 2019, another hate-filled white terrorist shot and killed 22 people at a Walmart store in El Paso. Again, he framed his motivation in part as railing against white genocide and the destruction of the environment. These horrifying events, I fear, are part of a growing foreshadowing of our dystopian future. As migrants are increasingly demonized, our borders are increasingly militarized, and our environment crumbles under the weight of global capital. Far-right ecologist and eco-fascist talking points are permeating our mainstream media and political discourse. Even center-left figures and tech philanthropists are laying the groundwork for what Naomi Klein calls climate barbarism, a deepening of the climate crisis along with the fortification of borders and a mass war waged on any and all refugees and migrants as we clamber to hold on to white Western power and privilege amidst total ecological collapse. The specter of climate barbarism is made possible by society's inability to own up to the root causes of the climate crisis: colonial plunder and capitalist expansion, leading commerce to mediate most of our relationships with the non-human world. Patriarchy is not off the hook here. Colonialism and capitalism are extensions of thousands of years of patriarchal governance predicated upon natural hierarchies and the dominance of women, minorities, animals, and the land. In this system, profits are generated by exploiting land and labor. Competition between capitalists leads to an ever-expanding system of production and consumption in order to keep accumulation going. This is a train that cannot stop, lest we suffer through deep recession. In order to keep production costs low, capitalists must procure raw materials as cheaply, which often means as destructively, as regulations will allow. And we've all seen how regulations are systematically undercut by both conservative and liberal politicians trying to free the market for more capitalist gain. Capitalism originated in Britain. Peasants were kicked off their land through enclosure laws and were then forced to sell their labor for a wage in terrible conditions, creating the sharp divide between the working class and the capitalist owners. This was achieved through brutal force and through pitting the working class against one another. Men against women, for example. Europeans then largely forced the system on the rest of the world, first at gunpoint, and later through exploitative institutions like the IMF and World Bank. But not all capitalisms were created equal. The colonial bullies who initially subjugated the rest of the world through colonial violence then proceeded to set up the global economic system to their benefit. They are continuing to extract unimaginable wealth and resources by exploiting the poorest laborers and environments around the world. The historical emitters, or those who contributed the vast majority to this problem, are thus unsurprisingly the US and the UK, the OG colonizers and imperialists. So forcing the system on the world created the majority of the problem. And then, in a bid to save more money and increase those profits, Western capitalists then outsourced the majority of our manufacturing, and with it, much of our pollution too. Now we have mainstream political commentators and politicians blaming the countries to which we have exported our dirty manufacturing, like China and India, even though the main market for all the products they're producing is the US. This doesn't mean that current high emitters like China won't need to reduce their emissions, and in fact, they've already made incredible investments into green energy, much more than Canada or the US. But we need to take a historical perspective so that we can understand where all of our global emissions came from and what is driving them. Neoliberalism is the economic system pushed by Reagan and Thatcher that thought that the best way to organize society is by freeing the market, involving privatizing state services, cutting spending on social programs, healthcare, and education, and liberalizing trade, allowing capitalists to outsource jobs so they could make more money. This was disastrous for the environment because it just gave capitalists more power to exploit resources and dump waste as they like, with fewer regulations to hold them back. The collapse of the welfare state, the busting up of unions, and the outsourcing of jobs made working class power plummet. Wages have stagnated while living costs continue to increase, and today we live in deeply precarious times. We have less job security, fewer benefits and pensions, and if we try to unionize and fight back, capitalists will either outsource our positions or automate them. This has been a global race to the bottom in terms of environmental well-being and human dignity. And for people who are blaming globalists, economic nationalism under capitalism isn't the answer either. Capitalism will run up against its inherent contradictions. It'll exhaust its local markets and local resources and will need to expand to stay afloat. That's why capitalists globalized in the first place. But the precarity of the system leads inevitably to unrest. People are angry, and rightfully so. But without any analysis of these broader systems, people are confused as to who and what is actually the cause of their problems. This has led to a far-right resurgence because opportunistic conservative leaders are throwing sand in our eyes by saying it's the fault of immigrants, not the capitalists. What this does is divide the working class, and it leads people to diffuse their righteous anger at the wrong targets. The only people this serves is the elite, who are driving the majority of our environment's destruction. 50% of global emissions are produced by the richest 10% of the world's population. The wealthiest 20% are responsible for 70% of emissions. And we know that a handful of corporations have done the most unspeakable damage. This is pretty self-evident because the more affluent your lifestyle, the more unsustainable your consumption will be. Per capita, what do you know? North American gluttons are atop the list, emitting more than double the global average per person. Understanding the root causes of this problem, and understanding which corporations, which classes, and which states are most responsible for environmental destruction, we can recognize how cruel the injustice that the people who had so little to do with causing this problem, the majority of people in the global south, are the ones who are going to be hit first and hit the hardest. As Naomi Klein writes, in any moral universe guided by basic human rights principles, these victims of a crisis of other people's making would be owed justice. The wealthiest 10 to 20% of the world would be on the hook to fund a rapid energy transition as we dismantle this exploitative and unsustainable political economy that gives to the few at the expense of the many. They would also be on the hook to pay their climate debt to people in the global south who they have robbed so that communities could fortify themselves against extreme weather and protect their ways of life. And when this is not possible, when the land is too dry or the floods too high, justice means that all people deserve the right to travel to safety and to be treated with dignity. They deserve asylum and status on arrival. If your home was flooding, your possessions lost, and your children's lives in peril, is that not what you would hope to find? But instead, we have leaders, media pundits, and average people chanting, "Build the wall." We have progressives like Justin Trudeau denying asylum seekers the right to request protection at official border crossings if they're coming from the safe country of Trump's America. We have poor people left to drown in the Mediterranean or die trying to traverse the desert. And if they miraculously make it, they're being held in the most inhumane conditions. We have tech billionaires like Bill Gates focusing on population growth in Africa instead of attacking the system that made them billionaires in the first place, or taking a real hard look at the ecological footprint of accumulating those billions. And in this neoliberal, patriarchal hellhole, working men are feeling as though they are being emasculated because you can no longer support a family on one income, which was traditionally part of a man's perceived gender role. The far right is largely made up of sad, angry men who feel the need to remasculinize through violence against the other, anyone that they can feel superior to for any reason. They want to feel powerful in a disempowering world. And in this patriarchal system, the only appropriate emotion that men can display publicly is anger. The only appropriate response that they can have to fear or shame is violence against the other. A more productive response would be to hold space for grief and fear and anger, and to develop empathy and compassion for each other, which would fortify the working class and ensure that we are not divided. But we have leaders who are all too ready to fan the flames of racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, trans and homophobia, etc. to win votes.
These aren't people. These are animals.
They are being released by the tens of thousands into our communities with no regard for the impact on public safety or resources.
Murtaza Hussain, an investigative reporter who studied the Christchurch Killers manifesto, said that his references to immigrants as invaders find echoes in the language used by the President of the United States and far-right leaders across Europe. For those wondering where he was radicalized, the answer is right out in the open. It is in our media and politics, where minorities, Muslims or otherwise, are vilified as a matter of course. Eco-fascism is fascism with a flower crown. Like fascism, and like much of our mainstream discourse, it blames people who have absolutely nothing to do with our social or environmental problems, and thus, ironically, causes those problems to intensify. What fascists and eco-fascists want is essentially the same: an all-white ethno-state with Big Daddy Führer to kill or expel all the ethnic others, with eco-fascism being slightly more concerned with pagan aesthetics and Volkish tradition, which is an idyllic image of rural white communities as natural embodiments of national virtue. This is opposed to the urban areas where Jewish or non-white peoples typically reside, making eco-fascist environmentalism anti-cosmopolitan, anti-Semitic, and racist. Both fascism and eco-fascism are deeply patriarchal as well. Both involve fragile masculinities needing to oppress others, including women, in order to reassert a sense of waning male power. Eco-fascists are inspired by the environmentalist undertones that were present in fascist regimes such as Nazi Germany. On the surface, the Nazis might have appeared environmentally conscious and animal-friendly, banning vivisection and enacting the Right Conservation Act, but they employed a complete scorched earth policy, burned down land, supplies, and enormous amounts of resources on the Eastern Front for the purpose of creating Lebensraum, or living space, for Aryan communities. Hitler is also popularly confused for a vegetarian. He was not. He did eat meat, and he abused his pets. But fascism has always employed the language of environmentalism as part of its marketing to the public, even though they maintained a patriarchal and capitalist system that was very destructive to the environment and animals. The self-identifying eco-fascists of today are lonely boys, largely on the internet, who are drawing on this imagery in order to bond with other racist and sexist men. It's sad that we have a society that doesn't really allow men to develop supportive and nurturing friendships where they can talk openly about their struggles and emotions, because many of them are turning to things like this for community and self-comfort. They try to assert their masculinity by dehumanizing others using biological metaphors like referring to humans as vermin or weeds, or to other ethnic groups as invasive species. Their understanding of biology is limited, as there is only one human species, but that's an inconvenient fact for people who need to put others down for their own self-esteem. If races were species, which they are not, the most invasive of them would clearly be white people. Indigenous peoples were living with their environments for thousands of years, millennia, before white colonizers wiped them out and developed over them. Welcome to the late capitalist hellhole, #Western civilization. As an aside, this doesn't mean that all white people need to be expelled from settler countries. Decolonization means that we would respect indigenous governance and learn to live in reciprocity with the environments that we live in now, and honor the treaties, which we shamelessly reneged upon. But one of the main problems with these eco-fascist takes from a biology standpoint is that they imagine these ecosystems, these ethno-nationalist ecosystems, to always be in stasis, homeostasis, just perfectly in balance, unchanging forever. But if you talk to any biologist, that's not really the way that things work. Ecosystems are always in flux. They are always adapting, and new normals emerge all the time based on disturbances, climate variations, and the introduction or loss of different species. It's important to note that while we may associate fascism with lone wolf terrorists or people marching down the street with swastikas, that at the end of the day, fascism is really a legal framework. These boys can be dangerous, we've seen, but the real danger is that these talking points will be increasingly reflected in violent and exclusionary border policy and oppressive domestic policy. The mainstreaming of these views is what we need to fight most. One particularly dangerous eco-fascist talking point got mainstream media airtime recently, thanks to Tucker Carlson.
I thought, according to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and everybody else on the socialist left, that human beings are causing climate change, that humans, CO2 emissions, that's what's causing climate change,
right,
and it's going to be catastrophic. Well, if that's true, then why are we bringing people from all over the world where they produce CO2 emissions less per person in places like Mexico and Guatemala and places like that? Why are we bringing them to the United States, where we produce CO2 emissions per person at a much higher rate? Well, it doesn't make any sense.
And also, if you cared about the environment, which I personally do emphatically care and actually go outside once in a while, unlike most people on the left, why would you want a crowded country?
First of all, it's pretty rich that people's solution to America's unsustainable consumption isn't to reduce consumption or to attack American capital. No, it's don't let other people who aren't polluting pollute like we do. But if you look at the data, lowering population in our own country will not necessarily translate into a lower ecological footprint. As I showed in my overpopulation video, which I hope you will check out, overpopulation discourse misses the mark. If you look at the numbers, population growth is not directly tied to environmental destruction. For example, between 1980 and 2005, sub-Saharan Africa had 18.5% of world's population growth, but only 2.4% of growth in CO2 emissions. By contrast, the US had only 3.4% of the world's population growth, but 12.6% of growth in CO2 emissions. China's population growth rates have come down very quickly, but greenhouse gas emissions have increased since we set them up as our manufacturing warehouse. What this shows is that population is just one small variable, one small part of the bigger problem, and that in affluent countries like the US, even if they reduce their population, they could still see their environmental footprint grow. Decreasing population in a system based on continual growth is still never going to be sustainable, especially since it's only a handful of wealthy peoples, corporations, and institutions such as the US military, the greatest polluter on Earth, that are driving the majority of this destruction. Reducing population in non-emitting countries does nothing to address this, and unjustly denying people asylum in our own countries also does not help to solve the problem. Further, population growth rates have been in decline since the neoliberal turn, which has made it harder and harder to support families under capitalism. Population is set to peak and decline in the coming decades, which makes sense according to the demographic transition model. And if we look at the drivers of migration, most of them relate to Western imperialism and capitalist exploitation. Imperialism is a major driver of migration from Central and South America, as US-backed coups, wars, and support for terrible dictatorships forced so many people out of their homes. The same is true in the Middle East, where the US waged war based on lies for profit, control of oil, and to open markets to foreign multinationals. This is what globalization looks like. The CIA and the US military are the globalists, pushed on by capital's need to continually expand. And the toll on the environment is unconscionable. The Pentagon emits more than as many as 140 countries, and just 11% of the military budget could fund a renewable energy transition for every home in America. For reference, in 2017, the US military bought about 269,000 barrels of oil per day and emitted more than 25,000 kilotons of carbon dioxide by burning those fuels. And the Pentagon has long been exempt from climate treaties. Warren's green military plan is an absolute joke. There is no greening this capitalist war machine. Bernie is the only credible candidate as an anti-imperialist, and he's someone who responds to movements and could be pushed further. Poverty, another driver of migration, is heavily influenced by imperialism and debt bondage under the IMF and World Bank, who do not let countries spend on infrastructure or advancements, but rather force them to liberalize their economies so that they could be exploited further by multinationals and prioritize debt repayment above anything else. The climate crisis itself, which is driven by all of this, is set to be a massive driver of immigration in the next several decades, forcing people to flee their homes and risk their lives to try to travel to safety. And when they arrive, they are anything but safe. Another mainstream fascist talking point is, why should we let those dirty people in over here? Look how they treat their own country. There's trash everywhere. We don't want that here. Well, welcome to the global waste trade. Of course, capitalism has found a way to profit from dumping trash. Wealthy countries who overconsume and overproduce trash, which we can't dispose of ourselves and we don't want to in our own backyard, ship it off to poorer countries in the global south. We take advantage of the fact that they are overexploited countries and they need as many sources of income as possible, and we tell them this will be great for your economies. Meanwhile, global institutions tell them that they can't actually spend any money on infrastructure to deal with any of this trash. They need to prioritize debt and interest repayment. More often, though, we just ship it over there illegally without paying anyone and then try to deny it. Last year, the Philippines threatened to cut diplomatic ties with Canada if we didn't take back the 1,500 tons of plastic and electronic waste that we shipped over there and tried to dump illegally. They said if we didn't act quickly, they'd tow it back to Canadian waters and dump it there. On April 23, 2019, a Malaysian government investigation revealed that waste from the UK, Australia, the US, and Germany was pouring into the country illegally, falsely declared as other imports. So instead of dealing with the fact that we overproduce and overconsume, making mountains of trash that we can't even deal with ourselves, we just export it all, like we do with our manufacturing pollution and low-paying jobs, all in the name of capital. Without climate justice, the people who created the problem will keep on doing it, and the people who are harmed by the problem will continue to be sacrificed. Most of us aren't elites. We have more in common with the working people being harmed by this globally than we do with the capitalist class in our own country. Sooner or later, it'll be us being sacrificed too. Not that that's a good reason to show people human dignity. People are owed justice nonetheless, but it's still baffling to me that people can't see that we all have a stake in this. Capitalism is a global system by design, and it'll require global solidarity with our brothers and sisters of all nationalities and ethnicities to overthrow and move beyond this elite-driven system that harms us all and our non-human kin. Do not let the politicians or the media pundits divide us. Special thanks to Tristan for kindly editing this video. If you like this video, please give it a like and hit the subscribe button and consider becoming one of my monthly patron donors. You all make this show possible and I can't thank you enough. Check out my podcast at veganvanguardpodcast.com and I will see you in another video.